The shelter's fluorescent lights hummed their tired song, casting everything in a sickly white that made the world look like a place where hope came to die. Isabella Sinclair stood at the serving counter, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that still held traces of lukewarm coffee, watching the boy at table 7 draw with crayons that had been worn down to nubs. His name was Micah now. That was what the paperwork said. That was what the shelter called him when volunteers needed to know which child to walk to the bathroom or remind about dinner time. He was 7 years old, thin in the way that spoke of meals skipped, with dark eyes that seemed to hold memories too heavy for his small frame to carry. The October wind outside howled against the windows like something trying to claw its way in. Dead leaves scattered across the glass, and the sound of them scratching made everything feel dangerous, even inside these worn walls where donated blankets hung over broken radiators and the smell of industrial soup lingered permanent as a ghost. Isabella had kept the hospital shoes. That was the strange part. Micah's first day at the shelter, 3 months ago, he had arrived with nothing. One pair of shoes, white and sterile with a hospital identification band still attached to the laces. The staff wanted to throw them away. Isabella had stopped them. She had cleaned those shoes at the laundromat sink at 2 in the morning, using her fingernails to pick out the grime, and she had placed them in a plastic bag under her cot because something about keeping them felt like keeping a piece of proof. Proof that he existed. Proof that he mattered. She had $17 in her pocket. That was everything. Every coin, every bill. $17 to buy food for 5 people who depended on the shelter's kitchen, to replace the bathroom soap that kept disappearing, to survive until the next donation arrived or until she could pick up an extra shift at the diner where they paid her in cash and never asked questions about her background. The door opened. The wind came with him like a living thing, carrying the smell of November and expensive cologne and something else that made the other volunteers look up from their work. The man who walked through that door wore a coat of black cashmere that probably cost more than everything Isabella owned, everything she had ever owned. His hair was dark, silvered at the temples in a way that suggested he had earned those gray hairs through careful malice. His face was all sharp lines and controlled anger held behind dark eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw in a single sweep of the room. Behind him came 2 men in suits that fit so precisely they looked like they had been painted on. Tony and Enzo. The names meant nothing to Isabella, but the way they stood, the way they positioned themselves between the man and the exits, told her everything she needed to know about what he was. The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that happens when someone drops a plate or when a child asks a loud question. This was the quiet that happens when predators enter a space. The fluorescent light seemed to buzz louder. The radiator pipes clanked and groaned. The scratch of dead leaves against the glass became unbearable, like fingernails on bone. Micah looked up from his drawing. The man's body went rigid. His face drained of color the way a bathtub drains when someone pulls the plug, and for a moment he was not a man in a $2,000 coat. He was something broken. He was something that had been shattered 3 years ago and never quite fit back together. "Micah," the man whispered. The boy's crayons fell from his small hands. They rolled across the plastic table, red and blue and yellow, and no one moved to pick them up. Isabella felt her own breathing change. Something was happening. Something that existed in a space between the world as it had been 5 seconds ago and the world as it was now, and there was no bridge between those 2 states. There was only the space where everything would be different. The man dropped to his knees. Not in defeat. Not in surrender. His knee simply gave way, as if the ground beneath him had become unstable, and he went down like a building whose foundation had cracked. His lieutenants made no move to catch him. They simply watched, and in their eyes was an expression that said they had never, in all the years they had worked for him, seen anything like this. "Papa." Micah's voice was small. Tentative. Like he was testing out a word he had heard once and never thought he would speak again. Isabella's hands were shaking. She could feel it now, the trembling that started in her chest and moved outward until her fingers could barely hold the coffee mug. She set it down on the counter. The ceramic made a soft sound against the plastic laminate, a gentle click that seemed impossibly loud. She was still holding the hospital shoes in her other hand. That small bundle of white leather and memory, the first thing Micah had ever owned at the shelter, the only proof she had ever saved anything that mattered. The man's shoulders began to shake. His head bowed forward, and his hands came up to cover his face, and whatever was happening in that moment was so raw, so stripped of all pretense, that Isabella felt like she was witnessing something sacred and terrible at once. "They took everything from me," Isabella heard herself say. Her voice broke on every word, and she did not know where the words were coming from. They simply emerged from the place inside her that had been holding too much for too long. The fire took everything. My apartment, my documents, every piece of proof I existed. But I protected him. I did not know who he was, but I did not need to know. I protected him. Tears streamed down her face. She had not cried since the night the fire burned away her studio apartment and the carefully sorted second-hand furniture and the documents proving she had a social security number, a name, a place in the world. Her tears had dried up somewhere between the moment the smoke alarm screamed and the moment she stood in the ashes holding a photograph of her mother that somehow had survived. But now they came, and she let them come. The man looked up at her, and in his eyes was something that could have been gratitude or could have been something far more dangerous. Something that changed the shape of his face, that made the sharp lines become something different, something that looked almost human. Micah stood up from the table, his small body moving toward the man with the kind of certainty that children possess when they recognize something true. The distance between them was only 6 feet, but it felt like it took forever to cross. Each step was separate and distinct, a decision being made again and again, a small boy choosing to believe in something he had been taught not to believe in anymore. When the child reached him, the man pulled him close. His large hands, hands that looked like they had done terrible things, gentle hands, held the boy like he was made of something that could break. Tony and Enzo exchanged a look that said everything without words. In 15 years of working for him, they had never seen him like this. They had never seen him kneel. They had never seen him touch anything without the expectation of power. They had never seen him choose softness. "What is your real name?" Isabella asked quietly. She did not know why she was asking. She did not know what difference it would make. "Luca," the man said, still holding the boy. "His name is Luca Russo." The sound of his name hung in the air like a confession. Outside, the wind picked up, and 3 blocks away, in a high-rise office with windows overlooking the city, a man named Derek Collins was watching a video on his phone. The footage showed Micah at the shelter, playing, smiling, alive. Collins's jaw tightened. The boy was supposed to be leverage. The boy was supposed to be a tool. But the boy was alive, and someone had found him, and everything Derek had planned was about to become very, very complicated. And across the city, in an apartment that cost more than Isabella's entire annual salary, Evelyn Blackwell was reading a text message on a phone made of rose gold and intention. The message contained a name. Isabella Sinclair. And Evelyn smiled, the kind of smile that comes from someone who has just been given a map to someone else's destruction, and she began to type. But Isabella knew nothing of this. She stood in the fluorescent-lit shelter, holding a pair of hospital shoes in her trembling hands, watching a man kneel in front of his son, and she believed, in that moment, that she had done something good. She had saved someone. She had protected something that mattered. She did not know that in 3 weeks, the entire city would believe she was a con artist who seduced powerful men for money. She did not know that her name would become a hashtag, a joke, a cautionary tale whispered in coffee shops. All she knew was the weight of the shoes in her hands and the fact that she had kept them when she should have thrown them away. Drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Now let us go back to the beginning, to the invisible life Isabella lived before everything burned. In the sprawling, restless city of Chicago, where winter winds tore through the streets like blades wrapped in ice, lived a young woman named Isabella Sinclair. To the wealthy patrons whose meals she delivered, she was nearly invisible, just another girl in a stained apron, her name pronounced wrong by people who never bothered to learn it correctly. To the hurried crowd she navigated on her beat-up scooter that coughed and sputtered through rain-slicked streets, she was no one worth remembering. A shadow. A service. Something to pay in coins instead of bills. Her studio apartment occupied the 4th floor of a building where the radiator groaned through winter like a dying animal, where the stairs smelled like old cooking oil and broken promises. 42 square meters of space that she had furnished with second-hand furniture sorted by function, not beauty. A bed with a frame she had assembled herself using YouTube videos and borrowed tools. A desk where her accounting textbooks sat in perfect stacks, their pages marked with highlighter in 3 colors, yellow for definitions, pink for formulas, blue for concepts she did not yet understand but believed she eventually would. A filing cabinet where she kept documents in manila folders, her birth certificate, her social security card, her mother's death certificate from 2 years prior, her lease agreement, her student loan paperwork. Proof that she existed. Proof that she was a person who mattered, even if only to the government and to the creditors who sent letters addressed to her name at this address. She kept a budget spreadsheet on her laptop, updated every Sunday night in the laundromat while her 3 uniforms tumbled in the dryer. The numbers were precise. Rent, $1,200 per month, due on the 1st. She worked for shifts a week at Romano's, a restaurant on the North Shore where the clientele wore watches that cost more than her annual salary, where she memorized wine pairings she could never afford to taste. Food delivery on her scooter brought in another $300 on good weeks, less on weeks when her scooter broke down or when the rain was too heavy to pedal safely. Utilities, $180. Phone, $45. Transportation, $20 for the bus pass she used on days the scooter would not start. Insurance, $40, the bare minimum because the state required it. The remaining money went to textbooks, to food that was often leftovers from the restaurant's trash, to the 1 monthly payment toward the debt that had swallowed her entire life. $47,000. That was the number that followed her like a shadow, the number she had inherited from her mother's medical bills when cancer had decided that Isabella's careful mathematics could not negotiate with biology. Chemotherapy. Radiation. Hospital stays. The bills had arrived in envelopes thicker than the textbooks she studied. Her mother had left her 2 things, a photograph in a simple frame and a debt that Isabella would spend 30 years repaying if she maintained perfect discipline and perfect luck. She studied accounting between shifts, her textbooks propped against her knees in laundromats at 3 in the morning, believing that numbers and discipline and perfect attention could build something stable from nothing. That if she was careful enough, smart enough, invisible enough, she could escape. She could graduate. She could work in an office. She could sleep in a bed that did not shake when the upstairs neighbor played music. She could eat 3 meals on the same day. She could stop being no one. But the spreadsheet had cracks in it. The scooter had needed repairs that cost $350 in August, and she had not had $350. The landlord had raised the rent $50 without warning, and the margin for error had shrunk from $15 a month to nothing. The textbooks for her fall semester cost $890, and she had managed to scrape together $640, which meant she was using photocopied pages from the library and borrowed notes from a classmate named Sophia who pitied her in a way that made Isabella's chest burn with something between gratitude and shame. She lived on 1 meal a day. Usually rice and beans, or pasta with a can of tomatoes, something that could be divided into portions and stretched across a week. She had memorized which restaurants threw out their food at closing time, which dumpsters were cleanest, which alley behind which establishment would yield containers of barely expired bread or vegetables with blemishes too minor to sell. She had trained herself not to feel shame about this. Shame was a luxury. Survival was the only mathematics that mattered. The fire happened on a Tuesday in October, at 3:47 in the morning. She did not know it was happening until she woke to the smell of smoke, acrid and toxic, filling the 4 flights of hallway. The ceiling of her apartment was dark, not with night but with creeping fingers of black reaching toward the floor. She heard the landlord screaming, "Evacuate, evacuate," his voice cracking like glass. She grabbed the photograph of her mother. She grabbed her laptop. She ran. When the fire trucks came, they were already too late to save anything that mattered. She stood on the sidewalk at dawn wearing clothes borrowed from a shelter worker, clothes that hung off her frame like fabric on a hanger, watching the charred skeleton of the building still smoking against a grey sky. The smell clung to everything. Her hair. Her borrowed clothes. The inside of her mouth tasted like burnt plastic and ash. The filing cabinet was gone. The documents proving she existed, all of it, gone. The second-hand furniture. The textbooks. The spreadsheet that lived in her laptop, which she had been forced to leave behind when the smoke became too thick, now a melted circuit board in the ruins of the 4th floor. The budget. The careful mathematics of her invisible life. All of it had burned away in 4 hours while she slept. She stood there holding one photograph of her mother in a simple wooden frame, the only thing that had survived because she had grabbed it first. She was wearing shoes that were not hers. She had no apartment. She had no address. She had no proof that she existed anymore. The government might still have records, but the files she had kept, the careful documentation she had maintained as evidence of her own personhood, were now indistinguishable from the ash beneath her feet. Her pocket contained $17.32. That was all she had left. The shelter was on Wisconsin Avenue, a 3-story brick building with barred windows on the 1st floor and curtains on the 2nd and 3rd. St. Catherine's House of Hope, the sign said in letters that were supposed to be welcoming but instead reminded you that you were entering a place for people who had nowhere else to go. The director, a woman named Margaret with grey hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful, explained the arrangement in a small office that smelled like harsh cleaning solution and old coffee. "We can give you a cot in the back room," Margaret said, her voice neither kind nor unkind, simply factual. "You'll have access to breakfast and dinner. But we need you to work for it. For hours a day, minimum. We're understaffed. Kitchen, mostly. Or helping with the children's area." Isabella nodded. She had no other options. She had called 2 friends from her accounting program, but they had stopped answering her calls after her mother got sick. She had no family. She had no one. The shelter was the mathematics of desperation, the only equation that balanced. "I can work," she said. "I can work more than 4 hours if you need me to." Margaret studied her for a moment, and something in her expression shifted, became almost human. "You can take shifts as you need them. But you need to rest sometimes too. You understand? People need rest." Isabella moved into the back room that night. The cot was narrow and the mattress was thin, and there were 12 other women sleeping in that room, and the sound of breathing and shifting and quiet crying filled the darkness. But it was a place where her name was written on a list. She existed here. She was a volunteer, not a resident. She was useful. She was not nothing. That was when the child came. It was 3 weeks into November when a social worker brought him to the shelter. His name was Micah, she said, though the caseworker's eye suggested this was not his real name. He was 7 years old, thin in a way that made you understand why, small in a way that suggested he had learned to take up less space in the world. He had dark eyes that seemed too old for his face, and he did not speak much. He did not speak at all, actually, except to ask where the bathroom was and whether he could have water, his voice barely a whisper, like he was afraid his words might draw the wrong kind of attention. Isabella was assigned to work in the children's area on Tuesday afternoons. There were 7 children ranging from 4 to 10 years old, all of them waiting for things they could not name. Micah sat in the corner with a box of colored pencils and blank pages, and he drew. He drew pictures of a man with dark eyes and a face like stone. He drew this same man over and over, in different positions. The man sitting at a table. The man standing in a room with high windows. The man kneeling in front of someone, his hands reaching out. Each picture was careful, detailed, obsessed. Isabella watched him draw one afternoon in early December, watching the way his hand moved with precision, the way he seemed to be trying to capture something he had lost, or something he was afraid of losing. "That is a nice picture," she said quietly, sitting down beside him but not too close, giving him space. "Who is this?" Micah did not answer immediately. He kept drawing, adding shadows under the man's eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lean closer to hear him. "My father," he said. "He is looking for me. But my name is not Micah. My name is something else. I am not supposed to tell anyone. But he is looking for me, and I think I miss him so much I might break into pieces." Isabella felt something shift in her chest. She looked at the drawing again, at the dark eyes, at the intensity in the man's face even rendered in colored pencil on paper meant for children. "What is your real name?" she asked. "I cannot tell you," he said. "But I miss him. I miss him so much." He went back to drawing, and Isabella went back to watching, and neither of them knew that the man in the picture was 3 blocks away, in an office building with windows overlooking the city, orchestrating the search for a son he believed was dead. Neither of them knew that everything was about to change. Neither of them knew that in a few hours, a man would walk through the doors of St. Catherine's House of Hope and see his own eyes reflected back at him in the face of a girl who had chosen kindness instead of collapse. The shelter director sat across from Isabella in the cramped office, radiator clanking in the corner like a dying animal, and explained that they needed someone for the overnight shifts. $6 an hour above minimum wage. Free cot in the back. 1 meal per day included. Isabella did the mathematics in her head, the same mathematics she always did, and heard herself saying yes before the director finished speaking. The first night, October 3rd, bitter wind scraping the windows clean of any warmth, Isabella entered the dormitory where 23 children slept in rows of industrial cots. Most were already asleep, their breathing synchronized like some terrible chorus of exhaustion. But in the corner, under a window where moonlight pooled like spilled milk, a boy sat awake with a crayon stub in his hand. He was 7, maybe 8, with dark eyes that looked older than his body had any right to be. His hair needed cutting. His shirt had a stain that might have been chocolate or might have been something worse. But his hands moved with precision across the paper in front of him, drawing lines that became shadows, shadows that became a face. Isabella approached slowly, the way she'd learned to approach frightened things. "That is a nice picture," she said quietly, sitting down beside him but leaving space between them, the way animals needed space. "Who is this?" The boy didn't look up. His crayon continued its work, adding depth to the eyes, intensity to the jaw. When he finally answered, his voice came out barely audible, like he was speaking from underwater. "My father. He is looking for me. But my name is not Micah. My name is something else. I am not supposed to tell anyone. But he is looking for me, and I think I miss him so much I might break into pieces." Isabella felt something shift in her chest, some tectonic movement in the landscape of her own grief. She looked at the drawing again, at the dark eyes, at the strength in the jaw, at the hands rendered in colored pencil that seemed capable of holding the world or crushing it. "What is your real name?" she asked. "I cannot tell you," Micah said. He set down his crayon. In the silence that followed, the radiator clanked again, metal on metal, and somewhere in the building a child cried out in sleep. "But I miss him. I miss him so much." Isabella said nothing. She sat beside him while he returned to drawing, and she understood, in the way that only people who have lost everything understand, that this boy was carrying a weight that might collapse him if she looked away. Over the next 3 weeks, Isabella began to reconstruct her world around this child. She worked her double shifts at the restaurants, counted the pennies left over, and made choices that seemed impossible until she made them. She bought him socks, 3 pairs for $8, and new underwear because the shelter's laundry service destroyed what came to it. She read to him at night before sleep, books with bright illustrations that had nothing to do with dark eyes or fathers or the kind of missing that made you hollow. The small hospital shoes arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October. She had found them at a second-hand store 3 weeks prior, when Micah's sneakers had torn so completely that the laces couldn't hold them together anymore. She had paid $17. Her entire pocket money. Every dollar she had managed to save after rent and food and the mathematics of survival. But she bought them because he needed them, and because she understood that sometimes you invested in the people who might break if you didn't. When Micah opened the box, he stared at the shoes like they were made of gold. "These are for me?" he asked. "They are for you," Isabella said. "So your feet do not get cold. So you stay strong." He put them on immediately, lacing them with careful concentration, the kind of attention he gave to his drawings. "Thank you," he said, and Isabella heard in those 2 words everything he wasn't saying about fathers and missing and the kind of love that travels through replacement shoes. That same week, a new photograph appeared on Micah's paper. This time it was not just the man's face. This time it was detailed. The dark eyes held something specific now, not just intensity but anguish, not just strength but the kind of brokenness that comes from searching for something you believe is dead. The jaw was clenched. The hands, rendered in careful pencil, were clenched too. And underneath, in letters that looked traced rather than written, Micah had copied a name, Luca. Isabella's hands trembled as she picked up the drawing. She knew she should not look. She knew that looking might shatter something in the way Micah had described it, breaking into pieces. But she also knew that 7-year-old boys did not draw men this carefully unless those men existed. Unless they mattered. Unless they were searching through the dark. That evening, after Micah slept and the shelter was quiet except for the sound of rain beginning against the windows, Isabella walked to the public library 3 blocks away. Her knees ached with the cold. Her borrowed coat was not thick enough. But she moved through the October darkness like a ghost, invisible and necessary. The computer screen glowed like a terrible mirror. She typed the name, Luca Russo. Chicago. The results flooded her vision in cascading articles, photographs, headlines that seemed written in a language of violence and loss. Luca Russo, age 42, head of the city's largest organized crime operation. His son, Lucas Jr., age 7, vanished 3 years prior during a custody dispute with his ex-wife, Victoria Russo. The boy was presumed dead after Victoria died in a car accident. Federal investigations. Gang warfare. Unprecedented violence. Russo had supposedly dismantled half of Chicago's underworld searching for the boy, leaving a trail of devastation that suggested the man was not thinking, was not calculating, was only searching. The photograph in the articles matched Micah's drawing with such precision that Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The dark eyes. The strength. The kind of brokenness that comes when you lose everything and only want one thing back. She stared at the screen for a long time, rain falling outside the library windows, and felt the weight of knowledge settle onto her shoulders like a coat made of stone. She had $47,000 in debt. $17 in her pocket. A pair of small hospital shoes that represented every dollar she had been able to save. And she had the only remaining reason that the most dangerous man in Chicago had to live. But what she did not know was that Derek Collins had been planning this moment for months. The warehouse on the south side was cold and deliberately empty. Derek Collins stood near a broken window, watching the October rain, speaking into a phone that connected him to a network of darkness. He was 54, with silver threading through his dark hair, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's cars. But his eyes held something that money could not buy, the small, precise cruelty of a man who had made a career out of other people's desperation. The boy served his purpose, Derek said into the phone. Russo found him, and now he is vulnerable. Very vulnerable. He paused, listening to his associate on the other end. The real leverage is not the child. The child would trigger a response too violent, too unpredictable. But the woman, she is perfect. She is nobody. No family. No proof she even exists after that fire. Easy to disappear. Easy to use. He smiled, cold and thin as a blade. Russo will negotiate. He will break. Across the city, in an upscale restaurant where the clientele paid for discretion as much as cuisine, Evelyn Blackwell sat across from a journalist and prepared to burn everything to ash. Evelyn was 51, maintained and ruthless, with diamonds catching the low light like small accusations. She wore a designer suit in cream, and her nails were painted the color of old money. She had been Derek Collins's associate once, before their partnership fractured into mutual hatred. but their hatred of each other paled against her hatred of Luca Russo, who had destroyed her social position 5 years prior when he discovered she was selling information to his rivals. Isabella Sinclair, Evelyn said, sliding a folder across the tablecloth. The journalist, young, ambitious, hungry for a story that might matter, opened it hesitantly. Inside were photographs, documents, bank statements that told a particular kind of story. She appeared out of nowhere. No records after a convenient fire. Suddenly living under Luca Russo's protection. Playing the saint, volunteering at shelters, but it is a con. The journalist frowned. These accusations are true, Evelyn cut her off, her voice like venom in perfume. She seduced one of Chicago's most dangerous men for shelter money. Probably planted the boy herself, some elaborate con to gain access to his empire and his assets. I have witness statements, bank records, a pattern of calculated manipulation. She is a grifter who preys on powerful men, and I am going to destroy her before she destroys more families. She leaned back, watching the words land. By the time I am finished, everyone will know exactly who Isabella Sinclair is. And Luca Russo will be destroyed by the woman he tried to save. Meanwhile, in the secure apartment that Luca had arranged, Isabella sat with Micah between them, watching as the boy drew new pictures. These ones showed 3 figures, a man with dark eyes, a woman with tired eyes that were slowly losing their exhaustion, and a small boy connecting them both. Luca watched Isabella watch his son. He caught her staring, and something moved across his face, not violence, not the careful blankness he maintained for his empire, but something softer, something that looked like a man remembering how to be human. "What?" he asked. "I never expected a man like you to." Isabella paused, searching for words. "To be gentle like this." "I forgot how," Luca said quietly. "For a very long time, I forgot. You are teaching me to remember." The rain continued outside, steady and relentless, and neither of them saw the notifications beginning to populate social media. The first article had been published at 6 o'clock that evening, Mafia boss's new woman, con artist or savior. Isabella found it by accident, scrolling on the shelter's old laptop while Micah slept between her and Luca. Her photograph was there, pulled from somewhere, printed without permission. The article outlined Evelyn's allegations with the kind of specificity that made them sound true. Fraud. Manipulation. Seduction. $47,000 in debt, $17 in her pocket, and now her name dragged through public humiliation as a woman who preyed on powerful men. She stared at the screen, her hands shaking. Then the text message arrived on an unknown number, simple and devastating. "You have something I need. Let's talk about the boy. Derek." Isabella looked at Luca, asleep in the chair beside them, and understood that the danger had never been outside. It had been circling them the entire time, patient and precise, waiting for the moment when they had something to lose. The parking garage beneath the shelter smelled like concrete dust and stale oil, cold seeping through the air like a curse that could not be erased. Isabella Sinclair pushed the supply cart back to the storage closet at 4 in the afternoon, her breath visible in the dry October chill. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly white that made the shadows between the pillars look deeper, darker, more dangerous than they had any right to be. She didn't see him at first. Derek Collins stepped from behind the concrete support beam with the kind of deliberate slowness that meant he had been waiting, that he wanted her to know he had been waiting. 2 men flanked him, their shoulders broad enough to block the exits. Isabella's hand froze on the cart. "Isabella Sinclair," Derek said, his voice smooth and cultured, the voice of a man who wore tailored suits that cost more than everything she owned. "The woman who found Luca Russo's son. Quite the coincidence, wouldn't you say?" She backed against her scooter, the metal cold against her spine. Derek was 53 years old with silver threading through his dark hair, his face arranged into something that looked like a smile but carried no warmth, no human recognition. His hands were in his pockets, relaxed, which made him more terrifying than if he had shown weapons. "I don't know what you're talking about," Isabella said, but her voice trembled like a candle in the wind. Derek laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The boy. Micah. Sweet child. I placed him in this shelter 3 years ago, kept him breathing as insurance against Russo. A guarantee, you understand. And now you have given him back to his father, which means I have lost my leverage. He pulled out his phone, scrolling with one finger. But you, Isabella, you have made yourself valuable in an entirely different way. He turned the screen toward her. Photographs filled it, women with bruised faces, women who had stopped fighting, women who had simply disappeared into the machinery of his network. The trafficking operation laid bare in images, in evidence of the darkness he had cultivated like a garden. Isabella's hand shook, but she did not look away. Tell Luca Russo to transfer $10 million by midnight, Derek said, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. Or I will make sure everyone knows you were part of the plan from the beginning. I will destroy what is left of your reputation, and then I will make you disappear like the other women in my network. Like them. He gestured to the photographs. Tell me, Isabella, do you know what it is like to vanish? To have no one searching because everyone already believes you are guilty. Isabella straightened her spine. The hospital shoes in her pocket pressed against her leg, small and solid and real. I won't help you hurt that child again. Derek's smile widened. You have $47,000 in debt, girl. You are nobody. The articles are already running. The public is already convinced you seduced a powerful man for shelter money. Your name is synonymous with fraud and manipulation. You will do what I say, or you will burn worse than that apartment did. He turned and walked toward the stairwell, his footsteps echoing through the garage like a countdown. The two men followed. Isabella stood trembling beside her scooter, the weight of his words pressing down like the lid of a coffin being sealed. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and saw what she had been avoiding all day, 17 missed calls from unknown numbers, 43 notifications, articles spreading across social media like poison through water. Evelyn Blackwell's campaign had reached a fever pitch. By evening, every major news outlet in Chicago carried the story. Mafia boss's companion, gold digger or genuine victim. The shelter director called her in at 5 o'clock. Maria Gonzalez was a woman who had always defended Isabella, who knew her character, her commitment, her genuine love for the children. But when Isabella entered the office, Maria could not meet her eyes. I have to let you go, Maria said quietly. The articles, the accusations, donors are threatening to pull their entire funding if you continue working here. Isabella, I am so sorry. I know this is not fair. I know this is not true. But I cannot protect you anymore. I cannot protect the shelter anymore. Isabella nodded and walked out. In the hallway, the other volunteers whispered. She heard her name attached to words like con artist, manipulator, predator. The children she had read stories to, whose hair she had braided, who had drawn pictures for her on rainy afternoons, they were led away from her by staff members who would not explain why. One little girl, Sophia, turned back and asked, "Where is Miss Bella going?" And no one answered because no one knew how to explain that sometimes the world decided to destroy someone, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Isabella walked through downtown Chicago as the sun descended into October dusk. Her borrowed coat, the one Luca had given her because her own had burned in the fire, felt like wearing someone else's skin. People recognized her from the articles. A woman spat at her feet on Michigan Avenue and called her a gold digger. A man took her photograph for his social media. Isabella kept walking. She made it back to Luca's secure apartment on the 47th floor, but she could not stay. Derek's voice echoed in her mind, "I will make you disappear." She understood now. If she stayed with Luca, she would make him a target. Derek would destroy him through her. Evelyn would continue her public campaign until Isabella was erased from the city's memory. The only way to protect Micah, the only way to protect Luca, was to disappear. She left a note on the kitchen counter, just one line, written in her careful handwriting, "I cannot bring you more destruction. I am sorry." She left the hospital shoes beside the note, unable to take them with her. The Chicago River ran black beneath the bridge she stood on at midnight. Isabella gripped the railing with hands that had grown cold, her body exhausted from walking, from running, from the impossible weight of being nobody trying to become something and failing. The water moved below, dark and final, and for the first time in her life, she understood why people chose endings instead of continuations. $47,000 in debt. $17 in her pocket. A reputation destroyed. A child she could not protect. A man she loved more than her own survival, which meant she had to leave him. She closed her eyes and thought about disappearing, about becoming one of Derek's photographs, about giving up. But then she felt the hospital shoes in her pocket, the one she had kept since the day Micah arrived at the shelter, the one she had bought with her last money because he had no shoes, because he was a child who deserved to have something new, something that fit. She remembered his face when Luca held him for the first time in 3 years. She remembered the way he had stopped drawing pictures of dark eyes and started drawing families. She had protected something that mattered. She had not collapsed when her apartment burned. She had not given up when the city turned against her. And she would not give up now. Isabella turned from the railing and walked back toward Luca's office building. The night security guard let her pass without question. The elevator rose through the darkness. When Luca opened the door to his penthouse, Isabella stood soaking wet from the October rain, holding the hospital shoes in one trembling hand. She told him everything, Derek's threat in the parking garage, the exact words, the photographs of disappeared women, the midnight deadline, Evelyn's campaign destroying her piece by piece, the moment she stood on the bridge and considered not coming back. Luca listened without speaking, his face hardening into something ancient and volcanic. When she finished, he made a single phone call. "Tony. Enzo. Gather the others. We have 2 problems to solve tonight. One is Derek Collins. The other is a woman named Evelyn Blackwell." He paused. "And Isabella, this time they will not be walking away." By 4 in the morning, Derek Collins was gone. 12 men in black had moved like ghosts through the South Side warehouse where Derek kept his operation running. Derek stood counting money from his latest trafficking shipment when the door exploded inward. Luca Russo walked through the smoke, his face carved from controlled fury, his voice deep and solid like an oath made to saints. "You threatened the woman who saved my son. You prey on desperate women, make them vanish into your network, build your empire on their suffering. Death would be too quick, too easy, too merciful for you, Derek. Death would be mercy." Derek's knees gave out and he collapsed into sobs, trembling like a cornered animal. "Please, Russo, we can negotiate. The boy is fine, I never hurt him." Luca nodded to Tony and Enzo. "The Castelliano family has been looking for new territory. They also have a particular hatred for traffickers. I promised them a gift. You, Derek. You are the gift." Men Derek did not recognize walked through the warehouse door. Their faces carried the weight of 15 years of searching for a sister who never came home. Derek screamed as they dragged him away, his voice echoing off concrete, "Russo, please, not them, anything but them." He was never seen again. By dawn, Evelyn Blackwell's empire was collapsing. Federal agents raided her office as reporters gathered, their cameras rolling. The evidence was devastating in its specificity, bank records showing her financial partnership with Derek Collins, communications detailing her laundering of trafficking money through her legitimate businesses, testimony from 3 of Derek's victims connecting her directly to their exploitation. The campaign against Isabella had been designed to destroy Luca's empire by destroying the woman he loved, eliminating competition while covering her own crimes. Evelyn Blackwell was led out in handcuffs, her face frozen in shock and rage as journalists shouted questions she could not answer. Her assets were frozen. Her businesses shuttered. Her reputation destroyed in the same public forum she had weaponized against Isabella. Federal charges, racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit human trafficking. The prosecutor's recommendation was clear: 40 years in federal prison. Her lawyer sat across from her in the holding cell and delivered the final truth: "They have everything, Evelyn. Bank records, communications, victim testimony. You will die in prison. And when you do, No one will remember your name except as a cautionary tale of what happens when women prey on other women. Evelyn's face crumbled. By the time the sun rose fully over Chicago, the city was awake to a new story, not Isabella Sinclair the con artist, but Isabella Sinclair the woman who survived being erased and stood firm. The articles changed their tone. Donors returned to the shelter. Volunteers asked when she would come back to work. But Isabella was not thinking about any of that. She was thinking about Micah, sleeping peacefully in a bed that belonged to him now, in a home where he would never have to draw pictures of lost fathers. She was thinking about Luca, who had moved mountains to protect her, who had chosen love over empire when the choice had mattered most. She was thinking about the hospital shoes sitting on the kitchen counter beside her note, waiting to tell a story of survival, of protection, of one small act of kindness that had changed everything. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only love can do that. The blizzard had transformed the world into white silence. Snow fell thick and heavy against the lodge windows, accumulating in drifts that seemed to grow taller by the hour, and the wind howled through the mountain passes like something wounded and desperate. The log cabin sat isolated on 15 acres, surrounded by forest and distance, a place where the violence of Chicago felt like a nightmare that belonged to someone else's life entirely. Isabella stood at the great window watching the snow pile against the glass in layers, her breath visible in the cold air near the pane. She wore new clothes now, soft wool sweater in cream, jeans that fit without gaps, socks thick enough to cushion her perpetually aching feet. Simple things. Chosen for warmth and comfort instead of what could be found discarded or borrowed. Behind her, a fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, flames reaching upward like orange hands trying to touch the cathedral ceiling. On the mantel sat the small hospital shoes. Micah's first pair, the ones he wore the day she found him in the shelter. She had kept them all this time, tucked in a cardboard box beneath her cot, proof that she had once saved something that mattered. Now they were placed carefully, deliberately, like a shrine to survival. Micah slept on the leather sofa, finally peaceful, his small body curled beneath a blanket that cost more than everything Isabella had owned 3 weeks ago. His breathing came steady and deep. No nightmares tonight. No drawings of dark-eyed men he could not name. Just the sleep of a child who understood, finally, that he was safe. The door opened behind her. Luca entered without sound, carrying a leather folder. His cashmere coat hung over his arm, still damp from the snow outside. Even in this refuge, he moved like a man accustomed to controlling every space he occupied. But his face was different now. The sharp edges had softened. The violence behind his eyes had quieted into something resembling human grief. "Come," he said, his voice like dark honey, like something that had learned gentleness through necessity. "There is something I need to show you." They sat before the fire. The folder lay between them on the coffee table. Isabella did not open it immediately. She had learned to fear documents. Documents meant loss, meant debt, meant her existence being erased in carefully typed paragraphs. "Your debt," Luca said quietly. $47,000. Every penny. Paid in full. I also had lawyers recreate what the fire took from you. Birth certificate. Social security card. University transcripts. School records. The documents that prove you exist, legally and completely. Isabella's hand shook as she opened the folder. Everything was there. Everything she had lost standing in ashes, holding only a photograph of her mother. Her name appeared on official forms. Her identity reconstructed, validated, real. "Why would you do this?" Her voice broke like glass. "I am still nobody. I do not have anything to give you in return. I am not useful anymore now that—" "Stop," he said, and the word held no cruelty, only certainty. "You are not useful to me. You are necessary to me. There is a difference." He turned to face her fully, the firelight catching the scar that ran from his eye to his cheekbone, that permanent map of violence and survival. "I watched my father murdered when I was 17 years old," he said, and his voice dropped lower, each word deliberate. Rivals came to his restaurant at closing time. They shot him behind the counter while he was counting the register. I built everything I have since that night on vengeance. I dismantled half of Chicago searching for my son. I became something cold and violent because that is what survival demanded in this world." He paused. Outside, the wind threw snow against the window like accusations. "Then you stood between me and Micah in that shelter, crying about everything you had lost, about debt and fire and invisibility. You did not know who he was. You did not know what I could offer you. You just chose kindness when you had nothing left to give. That is not useful, Isabella. That is human. And you are teaching me how to be human again." He reached for her hand. His palm was warm from the fire, and she noticed for the first time that his fingers were trembling. "Do you understand?" he asked. "The moment I saw you, I was done. Finished. There was no universe in which I let you fall back into darkness." She could not speak. Words belong to people with solid ground beneath them, and Isabella was still learning how to stand upright again. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him, slow and careful, two broken people healing each other through the simplest act, the willingness to touch someone without asking what they could offer in return. When she pulled back, tears covered her face. "I am afraid," she whispered. "I am afraid that when you look at me, you see someone worth saving because I found your son. That the only reason I matter is because I was useful once. And when that fades, I will go back to being invisible. I will disappear again." "You could never disappear," he said. "Not to me. Not to Micah. Not to anyone who watched you choose protection over safety, kindness over survival. That kind of person does not become invisible. That kind of person becomes a light." Morning came gray and cold, the blizzard still raging but with less violence, as if even the storm was learning mercy. The three of them stood in the kitchen, and Isabella made breakfast while Luca and Micah set the table. Ordinary things. The kind of morning that happened in a million homes across America, unremarkable and precious beyond measure. Micah bit into toast covered with jam and looked up at Isabella with eyes that had learned to trust again. "Will you stay?" he asked. "With me?" "And with Papa." She looked at Luca. He stood in the doorway wearing a sweater she had never seen before, no armor of expensive tailoring, just a man who had learned that vulnerability was not weakness. He smiled at her, and the smile held all the promise of someone who had walked through fire and found something worth saving on the other side. "Yes," Isabella said. "I will stay." 1 month later, the Chicago courthouse stood austere and imposing beneath gray December sky. Isabella waited in a hallway lined with marble and institutional authority, Luca's hand steady at the small of her back. The courtroom doors opened. A judge read from the bench, officially clearing her name, declaring that all accusations were unfounded, that the articles retracted and apologies issued. Standing in the gallery were former shelter residents, volunteers who had believed in her when lies tried to bury her truth. They had come to witness her resurrection. When it was over, Isabella walked down the courthouse steps into dry cold that made her breath visible. Journalists called out questions, but she stopped and turned to face them. Behind her stood Luca, his hand on her shoulder. His men, Tony and Enzo, watched from the black SUV, and for the first time in their 15 years of loyalty, they saw their boss smile in public. "They took everything from me," Isabella said to the microphones and cameras. "A fire took my home. Debt took my stability. Lies took my reputation. But none of it could take my humanity. I chose to protect a child because it was right, not because it was useful. And I learned that the most broken people can heal each other if they choose mercy over vengeance." The words hung in the cold air. Truth, spoken plainly, waiting for the world to hear. The shelter where everything began still existed in the same neighborhood, still fed people who had fallen through the cracks of the world. But now it had a new program funded by an anonymous donor with a familiar name. Women who had lost everything. Women learning that survival was possible. Women discovering that second chances existed for people the world had declared invisible. Isabella placed a framed photograph on the wall of the common room. The small hospital shoes, mounted behind protective glass, with a plaque beneath, proof that saving something matters. Micah stood beside her, now wearing new shoes he had chosen himself, shoes that fit his growing feet properly. He traced his finger along the plaque without reading it. He did not need to read it. He lived inside that story every single day. Their home in Chicago was small by the standards of the world Luca inhabited, but vast by the standards of Isabella's previous life. A real house in a quiet neighborhood where children played in yards and neighbors did not know they lived beside a reformed crime boss. She studied accounting at the kitchen table, her textbook stacked neatly, no longer weighed down by the crushing math of debt. The numbers added up differently now. They added up to possibility. Through the kitchen window, she watched Luca teach Micah to ride a bike in the driveway. The boy wobbled and fell and stood up again, laughing, and Luca caught him before he could fall a second time. She had never imagined this version of him, a man patient enough to hold a bicycle steady, gentle enough to celebrate small victories with genuine joy. She placed her pen down and stepped outside into the winter air. The cold bit at her cheeks, but it was the kind of cold that meant you were alive, that meant you could still feel things. "Watch, Bella," Micah called. "Papa says I am almost ready." The boy pushed forward on the bike, Luca jogging beside him, one hand ready to catch him if gravity won. But Micah did not fall. He found his balance. He moved forward under his own power, the world blurring past, completely and utterly free. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only love can do that. Isabella understood this now, standing in the driveway of a home she would never have imagined possible, watching the two people she loved most discover how to move through the world without fear. She had learned it holding a pair of hospital shoes worth $17 while men who ruled through violence knelt before mercy. And she learned it every single day, in every moment, that being nobody could become being everything if you chose kindness when the world offered you ashes. If this story moved you, drop a like right now. Share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances and subscribe because tomorrow we have another story about love, redemption, and the courage it takes to choose mercy when the world demands vengeance. Thank you for watching until the very end.